Hello and welcome to today's workshop / teaching about trauma. I think talking about trauma is a very important discussion, especially nowadays where we speak about spiritual awakening, about consciousness, about the law of attraction, and many other different spiritual perceptions. And for me, the discussion about trauma is a very important one. Depending on where you are, the discussion about trauma is not as difficult as in other places. For example, people in Europe really don't like to talk about trauma. They don't experience trauma, and they would never say of themselves that they're traumatized by their childhood or whatever. Where people in the United States, for example, or in the more English-speaking countries, even though Australia and England and Canada are working, every country has a different perception a little bit, but in general, English-speaking countries are more open to understand that there is trauma. And especially in the United States, they're very open to the fact that they might have had trauma in their childhood. It's even used as almost a spiritual bypassing of oh yeah, it was the trauma, it was my childhood trauma that caused this. So, and I always ask myself, why is it that in different countries and different continents, the word trauma and the fact of trauma are treated so differently? And then I went basically down the rabbit hole again. I went down the rabbit hole and I analyzed everything because that's what I do. So in general, let's start with the start and with the definition of the word trauma. The word trauma comes from the Greek and it means basically injury in any shape, type, or form. There is no specification of the injury. So a trauma is an injury. So we have several different types of injuries that we can relate to in society. So when the normal Western medicine speaks about trauma, what they mean is a physical trauma. For example, you had a car accident and you broke your arm. And so the broken arm is a trauma, a physical trauma. You had, you fell down a ladder in front of your house and you bumped your head, that's a brain, a head trauma. So when a normal person in Western medicine speaks about trauma, they most probably mean a physical injury. Those physical injuries, they create a physical problem, but when that is healed, what's very often the case is that there is also caused a mental or an emotional problem with it. So that's where they start to mix. But let's keep the physical trauma as its own. So a physical trauma is treated by medicine, and they are there is an operation needed, or you need to make it still for a certain amount of time, and then the physical trauma heals, and then the physical trauma is gone. That's how Western medicine works. Then we have psychological aspects of trauma. In psychology, in trauma, they have a very fixed program how trauma needs to work. There's first the trauma. The trauma needs to be caused by a natural disaster. For example, you were in a tsunami, or you experienced a flooding or a fire, or anything like that, like a volcano that broke out. So there is a natural disaster or heavy violence. Someone came with a knife or with a gun and tried to shoot you, and then you survived that. It must be very severe, in psychology. And that trauma needs to have immediately after the case that happens, the natural or other violence, needs to have a direct trauma response like shock, numbness, very crazy emotions, that you're waking up and you're tearing up all of a sudden. It can also be with very sudden deaths of close people of you, that can also be viewed as a psychological trauma in psychology. So, but it needs to have a right after a shock, and any type of emotional expression of that shock. Is it anger? Is it very deep emotions, high depression, whatever? And the physical reaction to that natural disaster or violence trauma is always seen as very natural, very normal, and can and need to be treated with pills. So they give you certain pills to have not so much emotions, or to get you out of the shock, or to stabilize your body mind system. They speak actually from a soul shock in psychology, which is really interesting, I think. So, and then the third part of it, and that depends on you would also have speech therapy after this psychological trauma. So you would, let's say you were in a flooding and you were underwater and someone died and it was really bad and you got out of it. And then after that, you would have A, medication, and B, you would also for sure have speech therapy. You would go to a psychologist or psychiatrist and you would speak about the experience that you had and the experience that you were going through, basically, right? When that is done, and it is done well, then you have nothing left, according to psychology and psychiatry. But what can happen is when it's not going away, then it's called PTSD, post-traumatic stress syndrome. That is what what creates itself out of this severe soul injury, basically. That can also be the case for war people that were in war, that they react on certain kind of triggers, and they have a trigger PTSD. They have PTSD, they cannot sleep. That PTSD has a shit ton of a lot of different symptoms. But it's all under this code of PTSD. So that is what, according to psychologists, would happen. You had the trauma, you had the medication, the speech therapy, and that didn't work. And then you have PTSD, and that's your diagnosis. There you are. You go ahead and live with it. And you have medications for it, maybe, if you're lucky. So, and then these are the two possible ways that we have for a very long time to speak about trauma. And what's really interesting for me with that is both of them have a diagnosis first, and then have a certain kind of treatment of the physical body, or even the brain chemistry, but there is no further movement in that. You speak about what happened, but yeah. And then 25 years ago, there came up some integrative coaching technologies, coaching therapies, some integrative trauma therapy methodologies. And they have a completely new way of speaking about trauma. And I think it's really an interesting one, because it's the one that I use with my clients, but I think it's especially interesting because it takes into consideration the capability of your nervous system with the age. So in integrative therapy, we speak about trauma when your nervous system at the time you were experiencing something was not capable of transforming the information received into the subconscious landscape. That's it. And there, of course, depending on your age, or depending on your how you were brought up, or how your general nervous system worked, you have a weaker nervous system or a stronger nervous system, and you have the capability of transforming into situations or not. And that's nothing. There's nothing wrong with you if you're weaker or stronger. In both cases, everything is fine. And I really like that part. So I really like example when I'm working with my clients. I always work with examples. So let's say a man that is 45 years old. He is living in the same apartment for 18, 20 years. And that man needs to move out of this apartment because the apartment, the building is being evicted because it's not safe anymore. And that person, if that man has no trauma with moving around or with anything that happened in his childhood, he will probably just move the apartment. He will be like maybe a little bit annoyed that he had to leave, but it will be packing the bags and going. Whether when someone has experienced, the same man who would have experienced trauma because he had to move away when his parents got divorced when he was 8, and he had to get out of school, and like it was really at the time for an 8-year-old, moving is a quite heavy. It has a quite heavy impact. Moving places is like, it's a lack of security, it's a lack of friendship, it's a lot of insecurity in general. And for someone that has experienced that, for example, together with the divorce of the parents, for example, together with a death even of a parent, then moving is something very difficult. Then moving out of this apartment for that 45-year-old man after 20 years being there would be a severe re-traumatization. It could be like very traumatizing for him to move out there again because his trauma resonance would start to work. He would be triggered by it. And the word trigger is like a word that people like often understand, but also get like a very wrong impression of it. A trigger is just like something is being triggered that was always there. You just didn't feel it. So that person would be triggered and then would have more difficulty to move, right? That's one example. Or another example. For example, myself, I have had as a child cancer. I was in a hospital when I was 2, and I had to stay in the hospital back in the days for quite a long time. And so that was a severe physical trauma. But in addition to the physical, like the operation and the chemotherapy and the radiation therapy, back in the days, the parents couldn't sleep with you in the I wanted to say the hotel. No, the hospital. So they couldn't stay with you. So I woke up in the morning alone. And even though my parents gave their absolute best to be with me the most time of the day, I wouldn't wake up with them. I would wake up and I'd be alone in a hospital. There was nobody there but the cleaning lady. So for me, waking up alone or in a new place was for a very long time before I treated my trauma, was for a very long time very traumatizing. I would wake up and I would be very severely stressed because I didn't know where I was and it was not my place. And it's like my whole nervous system would be triggered by not being at home. So, and that would be normal. You need to consider that normal because a 2-year-old waking up not at home for a 2-year-old, that's a nightmare. That's just not ideal. And when you would not treat this trauma, that means that you're constantly you have a different type of behavior pattern when it comes to relationships. You have a different kind of behavior pattern when it comes to moving around or traveling or whatever. Like you start to have behavior patterns with that because that's how the law of attraction works. And by the way, if you're interested in the law of attraction and how that works when it comes to resonances, we have a video here. It's called The Law of Attraction. And you can watch it. And there's some more explanation to that. But back to the trauma. So in integrative therapy, we speak about trauma that you are in the age that you are or were, you were not able or capable to transform the experience overnight or over the next couple of days at least. So that's kind of a mild form of PTSD. Imagine a 5-year-old. If a 5-year-old experiences, for example, a movie like, what's a movie that everybody knows? Like Lord of the Rings. Is that even a movie? I think it is. Yes, it's a very evil movie. Okay, it's a movie. Lord of the Rings. So a 5-year-old by accident watches Lord of the Rings. So he sees all those monsters and this creepy guy with no hair. I don't know, Gollum. That one. That's creepy. So if a 5-year-old would watch that, a 5-year-old has not the capacity of the nervous system and the mind-body system to understand that A, this is a movie, B, this is not a reality, C, this is like I can stop watching it as well. Like also this choice to watch it or not. A 5-year-old doesn't know that. Whether if a 10-year-old would watch it, it's still too early, right? You can feel that. Like everybody would be like, yeah, I mean, Lord of the Rings with 10, that's kind of early because it's very evil. It's very very harsh and very, very violent as well. So you would probably also not give it to a 10-year-old, but you understand automatically that even for a 10-year-old, it would be different than for a 5-year-old to experience that. The capability of working through what you have experienced of a 10-year-old is a completely different one than of a 5-year-old. And again, when you would watch the same movie with a 15-year-old or a 20-year-old, then the nervous system has a different capability of dealing with what you experience. And in integrative coaching technologies or EMDR trauma therapy, whatever, we speak about trauma when the nervous system was not capable of transforming what was experienced. And that can be a movie. It can even be Ariel. Like I remember when I saw Ariel, this Disney movie first, and I saw this evil octopus woman. I was like scared. Like she was really scary with those ugly fish that she had around. And like depending on your age, your capability of transforming knowledge and transforming experiences, that's what you need to do. And that's why, like when it comes to children, like to protect your child from certain things, that makes perfect sense because they cannot understand it yet. And because they cannot understand it, they cannot transform it. And when they cannot transform it, that automatically creates a type of trauma because the nervous system was not capable to work through the experience. And when you look at trauma in this way, then all of a sudden it's not like, oh no, I have not experienced trauma, or oh no, like not just because you didn't die in a car accident almost, or you didn't experience a volcano eruption, or you were not like sexually abused, or you were not like hit in your childhood, or like experienced any like severe heavy trauma, doesn't mean that you were not traumatized. It doesn't mean that there is no trauma stored in your physical body where your nervous system was not capable of working through that. And I think when you look at it from that kind of angle, it would allow you to understand more of what your current situation shows you. Because every relationship type, every experience that you're making is currently showing you exactly where you could look at in your past. And every experience is most of the time, people like when they're coming to therapy with me, they often tell me, you know, it's always the same. I have always those bosses, which are really like bitching around and they're yelling at me. And like, yeah, if things happen to you 2 or 3 times in a row, if you're 2 or 3 times in a row have very strange bosses, very disruptive relationships, friends that are like that are not loyal, or like, you know, when something is repeating itself, it shows a pattern. And if there is a pattern, that means there is trauma that wants to be seen. So in this case, it doesn't have to be psychological trauma or medical trauma. It could just be trauma from your nervous system that was not capable of working through it. And therefore you can do something about that. You can like have a better reality, a better life when you watch those things. And we have a little video, and it's called How to Work Through Trauma. And if you want to watch it, it's on my alley. And thank you very much for watching this one, and have an amazing day.